Gee, it's great to see. I understand you're all freshmen, which is, judging from the questions, very, very impressive. You must have a great professor teaching the course to lead to such great questions. And it's great to see so many of you here. My father founded this center. He was a real estate developer, and he loved what he did. He absolutely loved being a developer. He loved developing mixed income communities. He loved everything about it. And he loved it so much, he thought that what better place to share that love, if you will, and encourage people to get into this is but Boston College. And his kind of dream was that, you know, through the coursework here, you guys who might not otherwise know anything about this business might get an inkling that might be something you want to do, particularly the community aspect of it, community building aspect of it. Real estate and urban action, how real estate can change communities to the positive, and lead people to do great things with it. He did it with housing. Housing was his urban action item. There are guys in the past, Jim Rouse, who did it with commercial and, you know, festival marketplaces and a whole bunch of people. So it takes a lot of different aspects of real estate to make a community and to change things around. Housing is typically on the leading edge of it because people ultimately are the ones who change the action. That's what we're all here for. We change things. And so let me tell you a little bit about this. This is going to be very short, and because it's better to have a discussion on things. Innis Apartments, Chelsea, Massachusetts. 96 units built in the mid-50s. State public housing. No major investment in the property for 60 years. Basically, a property deteriorating in place before people's very eyes, everyone in this neighborhood. Through no fault of the housing authority or no fault of the residents who live there. Just a straight issue of funding. Real estate needs to be invested in, needs money. Look around this campus. You know, these buildings exist because there's an investment in them and people are using them. Public housing, unfortunately, has always been shortchanged, both on the federal side and the state side. And this place is no different. This is the overview of what we're going to do. 96 units, mixed income building. We responded to a request for proposals from the city of Chelsea. It was a little bit unique, a state program that was designed to encourage alternative financing solutions other than what is typically done in a public housing renovation, which is using something called a low-income housing tax credit. That's usually how all of these things are done. The issue is that it's a finite resource. There's only so much allocated around the country every year. And there's a lot of people going after it, not just public housing officials with the most dire need, but community development groups, all in every city, every municipality. The state does a qualified allocation plan, setting up goals. They got to spread this limited resource throughout the whole state. And public housing authorities realize that they're not going to get all the money available to solve their problem. And their problems are greater than the money available to solve it. And so some of them, Chelsea Housing Authority being one of them, decided they wanted to go and try something different and see if they could get something different. There were two applicants for this RFP. I was one of them, and I proposed this mixed income development. Another one was another very good developer, private developer, but who focuses on the low-income housing tax credit world. And the Chelsea Housing Authority chose us because they wanted to have a real mixed income development. Sometimes when you do the low-income housing tax credit, basically it's replacing low-income units with low-income units. So people are better off, they have a better housing environment, but they're still, for the most part, living with other low-income people. This is a model that I proposed, and I didn't think it up. My father did it 60 years ago, 70 years ago in some places, which is basically a model that the private marketplace, the private rent, cross-subsidizes the low income and creates a mixed income environment within. So in these developments, you've seen Harbor Point, for one, right? You know, Harbor Point, if you went into a Harbor Point unit, your market rate person, you might be living next door to a low income person. So it's mixed on floor, there's no rich door, there's no poor door. From the outside, you don't know whether low income people live there or you expect market rate people live there. And over the years, I've been asked by people who grew up in the neighborhood how they can get a condo there. And it isn't a condo. That's how good it looks. That's the success of it. And so that's the model I thought would work. I think it works everywhere, frankly. And the other reason I go at that model is because the tax credit issue that I outlined before. There's not enough of them. You're in line with a lot of other people. Whereas, you know, if you look all around Brighton, Allston, Boston, probably where you come from, there are new buildings going up all over the place. Wood frame, you know, wood apartment buildings all over the place. And that's all funded with private capital. So whereas there's a limitation on the tax credit world, which is a great program, in theory, private capital is infinite. And so long as you can pencil it out and make it feasible, my theory was the private market would invest in it. And I didn't do this just out of a whim. I did a lot of homework myself. I took an investment banker through Harbor Point. It was a beautiful June afternoon. People were outside. We walked through it. You didn't know who was a market rate person, who was a low-income person. And that's what impressed him. And then after that, we went and we got some investors to kind of come over and talk about it. If we did this, would you invest in it? And the answer was, well, if it operates like Harbor Point, absolutely, I would. So what we proposed was we have to rely on the market rate, and so we have to increase the density. So if you see the 96 redeveloped public housing units, that's what's there right now. To that, we're adding 40 moderate income and 94 market rate units. Important, this one, the amenities. The amenities that are in this building will be the amenities you would find in any market rate apartment complex that's built new that you would go into. There's community rooms, you know, the apartments have all the latest appliances. I mean, the finish in the units that the public housing people will be living in are exactly the same as what the market rate people will be living in. And so this, from the outside, has to look and feel to the market like it's a market rate place. In this one in particular, we have some public space where we're going to have a daycare facility aimed mostly at the low-income folks so that they can put their kids someplace where they can go out and work. That's the biggest problem with public housing people, for the most part, is they can't find, well, like a lot of people, they can't find anyone to watch their kids. I mean, they're homebound, some of them. And so that prevents them from taking advantage of some of these opportunities out there. And we're going to have a playground and the like. This is an old history, but this is a kind of a site plan of the first version we did. We've changed this a little bit. Timeline's interesting because it takes a long time, real estate development stuff. You know, there's a lot of questions asking about how we dealt with the community, et cetera. And dealing with the community is why one of the reasons it takes so long. The other thing is that when we get into the state government of this program, very new program, Governor Baker made a very big commitment into small cities in Massachusetts on his campaign trail. This program is one of those promises back to them to help revive communities. And so this is something, although it's the governor's idea, when you get into the public world, there are some people who work in administration who aren't necessarily bought on to the governor's idea. And you need to prove to them that it works. They're looking out for the governor, and they want to make sure that what I'm coming and saying to them works. And so a little bit of learning curve then, because again, when public housing, someone in the state government sees a public housing finance package, they're expecting to see a low-income housing tax credit platform. And this is very different. So explaining to them how this all works, explaining to them that Harbor Point, what Harbor Point is, and before that another place, Kings Lynn, these kind of market-oriented places that have a mixed income component in it. It's new to them, even though it's been done before. And, okay, this is pretty accurate. Relocation began the end of 2. But you've seen some, I guess you've been on site visits and you've seen some existing public housing, Mary Ellen McCormick, right? Well, that's what this place looks like, exactly like that, but worse, because it had less funding. This is our schedule going forward. It takes a long time to get in the ground, and it takes a long time to build it too. So we're going to bring people back in the first phase in August of 2024, and then deliver buildings throughout and move everyone back in. This building at the far is a parking garage above some retail and community space. The other 2 buildings are, this is just the residential buildings. There's some play area in the first building, Building A. And here's the new mix of bedrooms within. Public housing is typically built with a lot of 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 and 6 bedrooms. And so we had to replace that exact program on a one-to-one basis in the building because there were some bigger families in the building. The market, which is people out of school and people my age, they don't need 3 and 4 bedrooms. So the market rate is typically in a studio 1, 2 bedroom scenario, as you can see from that layout there. And what you'll see is the market rate unit mix is virtually identical to anything you'd see in any market rate building. We all do the same thing. We're going after the same market. And so this is what's going to make the whole thing work. One of the things you run into is all of these public housing projects, they're full, right? I mean, there's a big housing crisis. And these are the poorest of the poor, and all these public housing, there's a wait list on public housing, in Boston it's 40,000 people. There's 10,000 public housing units in Boston, a wait list of 40 or 50,000 people. So these places are full despite the fact that they're in horrendous condition. As we had the 96-66 were occupied at the time of closing. The goal was to relocate as many people as possible, because a lot of kids and families in Chelsea itself, which was successfully done. A lot of them went to other vacant public housing units in Chelsea public housing, and then a few people have moved out outside of Chelsea, family or something. So that's a pretty good success rate of keeping people in the community who want to be in the community, and not moving them someplace else during this construction period. This is the cost, the breakdown. This is private money. That's the big picture right there, the private money. The state's putting in this $28 million. I guess you've had a little bit of education on how a budget works and all that kind of stuff, and that's what we do here. No more complicated than that. This is a presentation, by the way, that we did for the board of the Chelsea Housing Authority. So there's a lot of, this is what the Housing Authority gets out of the deal. Might be interesting, might not be interesting, but, and this is the finished product.
So what are the risks that you've had to take from the very beginning of doing this project?
The biggest risk is time, you know, because you got to, 5 years, you're paying people for 5 years. And the risk in this stuff is particularly this, is you didn't know whether the Housing Authority at the end of the day was going to buy off on it, or the state for that matter, once all the numbers came in and how it all. And we were in a period where the cost started rising, particularly after COVID. Costs really took a climb up because of all the supply chain stuff. So this has had risk all over the place from the get-go.
So I remember when you hit the kind of construction materials price wall, right?
Oh, yeah.
What was that all about? What was the degree or the scale of change from between the initial pro forma that you guys used to, that you were operating with before this major cost wall hit
Well,
you?
in fact, we had gone into it with kind of an innovative panelized type, everything built off-site, shipped on-site, kind of a program, a little bit innovative. And
So take a pause there and describe that. I understand what you mean. But
well, I guess what you call, might have heard the term modular, right? Modular housing, for example. And it's a version of that, but it isn't, it's building the walls off-site as opposed to building them on-site with various workers, right?
And it's to speed the construction process, right? Supposedly.
It's into kind of, it's supposedly going to be cost less too, because it's in a labor in a controlled environment, in a factory built, as opposed to a guy outside in 20-degree weather and, getting interrupted by, snowstorms and the like, right? So there's a lot of, as it turned out in the summer of 2020, we got numbers back. The project was like $135 million, which is no way we're going to get it done with at that number. So we took a dramatic change of pace. We hired a new general contractor. We changed all the specifications. We went back to more of the typical model that you do with an on-site construction. And we got the number up there that you saw on the chart, which made it work. So that number was what, I don't know, it was $115,000, $115 million is the construction cost, as opposed to $135 million 2 weeks before.
So it was a 10 to 15% cost increase.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah. So you started talking about the state, and everyone in class has read the first part of Decent Place to Live. They're moving into the second part of the Decent Place to Live, and in the third part of Decent Place to Live, it outlines some of the historically what had to be done to create mixed income communities. Some of the first ones, Kings Lynn and Harbor Point. In both cases, there was an instance when the developer had to work with the state to change laws or change regulations to make the development actually happen. You were in a similarly innovative situation. Can you describe what the situation was and what the state wants to do with PAO?
The innovation with the PAO was, the innovation is that you can get the private capital to fund this thing with which is 40% affordable units in it. That's the innovation, because it's already proven that it's an operating model based on Harbor Point and in Kings Lynn. A mixed income, market rate people will live beside low income people. That wasn't the innovation. That's already been proven, right? The innovation was the financing of it. And the innovation was that a private capital would come in and fund this same thing, because that hasn't really been done a lot. I mean, maybe at all to that degree. There's a lot of inclusionary zoning. You hear that term a lot out there, where there might be, 10% of the units are affordable to some income level, right?
Usually geared towards middle income
It's mostly
or higher
someone
income.
everything is measured of area median income. So roughly in Boston area median income is $100,000, right? The usually affordability requirement in inclusionary zoning might be 80% AMI. So someone making $80,000, right? That's not really, someone has a lower income, but that's not someone who's poor. That's someone working and, public housing, to qualify for public housing, you can be no more than 30% AMI. So making $30,000 a year. But in fact, the average income of a lot of people living in public housing might be $12,000 a year. So these people are, really, really poor. So not only are we have some high affordability percentage, the affordability is for people who are really, really low income. I mean, you won't, these people you don't associate with on a daily basis, right? And so the innovation was getting the private capital to buy on to that idea, right? Now, we also used, over the years, both with the previous governor and this governor, there've been some tools that have been brought out to try and encourage the production of housing generally, okay? One is a zoning program called 40R, all right? And what that tries to do is a community, if you are open to zoning multifamily housing, we'll give you an incentive of X amount of dollars if you approve this zoning in your community. So we use that, right? The other toolbox we use is there's something in Massachusetts called a MassWorks grant that gives the municipalities for roads, sidewalks, all that kind of stuff. And any community can apply for it. But there's a special priority if you have a 40R approved. Then along with that comes this infrastructure package that the city can apply for.
So you're talking about these funding programs. I know it sounds like an alphabet soup.
It is.
And it sounds really detailed and nuanced, but they're really important. Like we went to Whittier and we sat in a park that was between the DeWitt Center in Lower Roxbury and the new Whittier housing development. Yeah. And there were chessboards there and nice seats. We weren't there 10 years ago, right?
No, right.
So why, that's an example of that kind of investment, but what are some of the examples of some of those things, or how's that money going to be used in the Innis apartments?
In Chelsea, it'll be, the sidewalks along Central Ave, for example, will all be done over, which is something you'd have to do anyway. Sewer lines. In this case, the city is extending a sewer line. It's going to connect some other sewer lines in it, that's going to benefit the whole city, that they wouldn't have had the money to do had not this
really sexy, interesting stuff, right?
Yeah, that's what infrastructure is, right? That's why the president's trying to sell it, because and no one's buying it, but it's because it's not that sexy. But you need help. And by the way, a lot of developers, even if they're not doing this kind of work, trying to get infrastructure help anyway and take advantage of this 40R zone anyway. Nothing to do with public housing at all. It just so happens these are tools that obviously the state was familiar with because it's their initiatives, but it really made the public housing aspect of it work.
Can you talk about PAYO again, right? What makes this is going to be the first PAYO project, right?
The first one in the ground, yeah. Sadly, it's meant for public housing, state public housing. I think when we first, and it's a step where the housing authority procures a developer, and together you pursue a plan with the state. And there might be 150 housing authorities in the state, and only 3 apply to the program.
Why? What was the fear, or what was the? Was there not a big enough incentive, or was it not attractive enough? What when it?
There's a lot of the housing authorities are very parochial, and they somehow think that if something comes, it'll take it out of their portfolio, and if it's out of their portfolio, they won't need them anymore, right? Which isn't the case, because in this, for example, the housing authority is going to have an ongoing asset management role for the length of the list. We have a 50-year land lease with it. And the housing authority's role in this is to ensure that we are living up to our obligations to the public housing tenants, okay? They're the protector of them from us. They're not gonna have to do that, but that's their role. The public still has a role in this thing. It's still public property. They own the land underneath it, and because of that, and they have an obligation to those low-income people in that housing. They're effectively housing them. We're just kind of the vessel for
the service delivery mechanism.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So as part of the service delivery mechanism, kind of break it down. We stood out front of Harbor Point on the DCR land, and I explained to students why it's important that Corcoran Jennison actually mows the lawn, takes care of it, makes sure the fitness equipment's safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So what is the responsibility of the housing authority? What do they do, and what do you do, and who is going to do it for you? I mean, you're not going to,
Well,
Joseph J. Corcoran is not going to be running a landscaping company out there, right? So who are going to be the service providers out there?
well, the same you would get for any apartment complex whatsoever, right? And the housing authority will have no day-to-day operational responsibility for anything there. Because again, what we have to do, and why they did this at Harbor Point, is we have to keep the property looking to a level that's going to attract a market rate person, right? The market rate is what makes the thing work financially, period. And so if you can't attract the market there, you're not doing any, the low-income people aren't going to benefit. You got to attract the market there. That's what's paying the bills. That's what's paying for supportive services for the residents who need them. That's what's keeping, putting the capital back into it and replacing refrigerators when they wear out, and carpets and floor and all that stuff, keeping it looking. The name of the game, and this is kind of it's a funny thing, because it's maybe on one hand it's a pure capitalist notion that you got to get the most rent and keep it full, right? And that's true, because we're all privately financed, private investment. But the beneficiaries are of the residents who live there, because they're always going to be living in, our property will never ever look like what they're coming from, ever. That's the discipline of the private marketplace, right? It won't let us do that.
So I want to ask you 2 questions. So this is like a really capitalist approach to doing it. On the other hand, though, it's principally, it's what social housing is in Europe, more or less, except a private sector instead of a quasi-public organization, right? So if you were instead of being a private sector developer, you were a quasi-public organization or a privatized version of the housing authority, it might just be like social housing in Europe.
Well, I think the discipline of having to keep it fully occupied, we're going to have a mortgage, right? And we got to pay back an investor his return on his money. I don't think a quasi-public would be able to do that or understand that concept, right? I mean, that's a real, that's a real business concept, right? And even, we actually spent a lot of time on the construction number, and we actually would show our progress with the public officials. We'd bring the contractor and explain, this is how it all works, right?
An open discussion, an open negotiation.
100% open book. I mean, they know what we're making off of it. They know what the investor return has to be on it. We treat them as a full partner, right? But I don't think, a quasi-public would be able to maintain it to this level. They wouldn't have to, right? They wouldn't have to. But we do.
They wouldn't have the interest in doing it.
Well, they don't have the need. I mean, if first of all, they mightn't get the private capital to invest to begin with because of the public nature of it, right? That's kind of a...
So that raises the other question that I want to ask is, so Chelsea wanted to do this. They had this, 70-year-old asset, not doing well.
Right.
What do they get out of it in the long run? I mean, do they still have to spend money to be the asset manager?
No, they don't. Well, they get money for being the asset manager.
And so what about the delivery? So what do they lose, I guess? What do they lose at this?
Well, they don't lose anything. I mean, what they gain is they gain 96 new units of housing that they had no way of ever replacing from the state or any other method. And so, housing authorities' interest, and they're genuine, they're, in spite of some of the condition of these properties, they do feel a mission to house this population. And they treat them as their residents. And Chelsea's like that too. So the way they look at it is they're giving their residents an opportunity to be in good, affordable, safe housing that'll always be capitalized. In other words, it'll always, they won't have to spend any money to maintain that stuff.
So they don't need an ongoing operating. They don't have to go begging money all the time for HUD or anywhere else.
Or anywhere else, or the state. I mean, they don't have to do that.
What about the other properties that they have?
Well, they would probably like to do something like this. But our whole effort was, and hopefully this'll, we're going to speak in a couple of weeks to a trade association of public housing authorities. And we're going to go with the housing authority director in Chelsea, who's a big fan of this, obviously. And he's going to tell his contemporaries that his experience and why they should do it. And, they don't have to do it with us, but just, there's a lot of the market rate world who can get into this business, right? I mean, private capital is going all over the place, and I've just proven that private capital will do this. So the idea is that, and again, we have the housing authorities think in terms of if I want to renovate or replace my housing stock, I use this low-income housing tax credit program. Those two are connected, okay? And so the next thing that stems from that, yeah, but I heard you can't get those. So we don't do it, so this is kind of the feedback loop that occurs because of what the one source that we're aware of.
Yes, it's a problem, but this is the only way I can solve the problem. It's too complex. I can't deal with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't have the time, the resources,
Let's see if we can renovate 2 units at a time and get things, fix the plumbing and do that kind of stuff. Okay. And so hopefully what this new program and the success of this project as part of that, hopefully it'll show that there's another way, okay? And because there's certainly plenty of need.
So you're talking about need leads to the last question that I have before I open up to student questions and you're talking about what it could lead to, and actually moving with the Chelsea Housing Authority. Who else in Massachusetts has anybody picked up on this and started? You said there's 3 projects. Has this already introduced more people to the?
Well, there's another one in Somerville that took a different approach, and it hasn't got off the ground. And that was take all the low-income people and put them in a tax credit-funded building, and beside it build a market rate building. And the market rate building would buy its land, and those land proceeds would subsidize the low income. Okay?
That's more of a four-door approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're having trouble on the finance. I don't know the nature. I've had my own troubles. I haven't got into what theirs are. But it's, I don't think that, first of all, I don't think that, for me anyway, is a social model. I don't like it at all. I mean, I just think, listen, I grew up with this model. Okay? I mean, I've been aware of this model since I was 12 years old. I put my first housing project when I was 12 years old in Lynn. And my father always did it this way. And so that's the way I know. And I measure other solutions from what I know. And there's some pluses and there's some minuses in other ones, but I think this is the best myself.
Great. So I'm going to turn to students now, so I've taken all your questions and I've grouped them just like I did last time into different categories: community engagement, timing of the development process, and questions about Joe's team, and then mixed income residents and challenges. So I'm going to start with a section that is on relocation and return of residents. And I'm going to ask Daniel and Elizabeth and is it Carola, right? Is Carola here? If you guys could be prepared to ask your question. I'm going to ask the first question though, which is Avery's question. What is the plan for the residents when you tear down the apartments there now and you develop the phases? And there's a question about what's the potential for people not to return.
It's the number one thing you have to deal with in this type of a thing, because they're all full. So what we do, we hire, there's a what we call a relocation specialist, and we hire
They met Sue Connolly.
Okay, so what their job is to find replacement housing for people who will be displaced during construction. And as you can see, in Chelsea, it was pretty successful. And it can be within the Housing Authority portfolio, or it can be with outside, private market. And it'll give, so it's a big deal. And it's one of the things that, it takes longer because first you have to make those moves. And these are traumatic moves for people too. I mean, a lot of them haven't moved anywhere before. And so, and they were always concerned about where their kid's gonna go to school and how far from the doctors and the whole bit. So you take all that into it. They first have to go and survey the people and find out what the needs are and try to the greatest extent possible, match the needs with the new location. For example, we made a commitment that to the school department that if someone had to go to, say, Everett to be relocated, we'd make sure they get transportation back to Chelsea to go to school, the kids. Okay? As it turns out, we didn't have to go to Everett. We did it all, we did it all within Chelsea, but for 2 people. What was the other?
Daniel, are you here?
Yeah.
So do you have your question?
Is there any way for the residents to return back to the neighborhood if they wanted to?
They all have a right to come back. Everyone who lived there has a unquestionable right to come back. No questions asked. That's governed by state law. And then what we do is we also give them, with the Housing Authority, a letter of assurance, just to give them that comfort. Because sometimes in public housing developments, rumors fly pretty quick, and there's always a rumor that they're going to kick you all out and no one can come back. Always. And you always got to reiterate that that's not the case. And we encourage them because, I think that it'll be a great place to come back to. So if anyone's, ever trying to kind of think that might not be the best for them, we try and encourage them to come back.
So Mr. Corcoran said that he was proud to be part of a team that was ensuring the long-term affordability of the communities. what are the steps that are being taken to ensure long-term affordability? You talked about the 99-year lease, but what guarantees that this doesn't just turn into pure market rate housing eventually?
Well, it'd be, you have agreements with the housing authority for that in the lease. The ground lease itself becomes an operating document of what your requirements are with the housing authority. They own the land, so we have an agreement with them, and they're the enforcer of it. So they get reports every month. They're also an asset manager, so they get all the information every month. They create the waiting list. We pick from a waiting list that comes through the housing authority of residents who are looking for public housing. So there's no way we could get out of it without being seen. I mean, we wouldn't do it anyway, but I mean, there's no way it would happen if the housing authority is keeping their eye on us, which they should.
So there's a number of questions about how this project is going to impact Chelsea.
What makes this different from other mixed income developments, or was it not?
And then I noted, so what is making this different than other mixed income projects?
Well, I guess you got to go to the question of the definition of what a mixed income project is, right? So there's a whole wide range of what that means. Just like there's a whole wide range of what affordable is, right? Affordable can be to low income people, it can be to middle income people. The moderate here is 100% AMI. That's the cap on the moderate in this particular building, right? Mixed income in my mind is where 50% or more is market rate housing. And then anything that can happen beyond that. That's my definition of it. Now, you would have, you saw Whittier. And Whittier, the developer there is POA, and they say that's a mixed income community. And it is a mixed income community. But there's no market rate, pure market rate in it, more or less. It's all funded with a tax credit base. And there's going to be public housing people in it, and people who are at 60, 80% AMI in it. But that's a mix of incomes too, right? So I kind of have a term in my mind, what I like to do that will attract private capital is a market mixed income, suggesting that what I do is try and get private capital and rely on market rate to create the mix. That's how I fund it. And I think that's, I think, when you think about a city, right? I mean, a city has a bunch of different incomes in it, right? So you go to some part of some cities and it's all, rich people, and you go to some parts and it's all poor people. But generally, there's a mix of different people in neighborhoods, especially around here. Like you live in Brighton, if you live in Brighton off campus, I mean, there's some people paying high rent, and there's some people paying low rent, right? So I think a mix of incomes is a kind of a pretty broad mix of incomes. That's what I think. But, others think different. There's a whole series of definitions that you can use, and none of them are wrong. It's all a function of how they're financed, right? So if you're relying on a tax credit base, you're going to build mixed income, you can, but it's going to be different mixed income than what I'm doing. My mixed income is going to be more market rate based. So
what's this? I know that this is kind of loaded, but what is the social benefit of that? Why is it so important? Right? Everybody talks about having mixed income communities. Whittier is very, very proud. Right? The Boston Housing Authority is very, very proud of what they've done there.
Yeah.
And so is the preservation of affordable housing.
Yeah.
And it's going to vastly improve that neighborhood. But what's the difference? Why make such a distinction? Why make such a push for this?
There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a matter of, I guess when you go back to it, it's how you finance it, right? The way they're doing it at Whittier is going to be a different mixed income than what I'm doing. And, I don't think what they're doing is bad. I I just don't think it's as good as what I'm doing. But that's me, right? I think there's a greater mix is better. I mean, I think when you think about, there's a public housing people, when they're living in these horrible places, they feel a stigma from the outside world about where they live. Everyone knows you're from the project, right? They walk by Innis and they know you're a project person. And because of that, a lot of people think not too highly of you because you are. What's wrong with that person? Why are they living in public housing? Must be something wrong with them. And by the way, they must be beating that place up. Look at it. They're not taking care of it. So they feel that. None of that is true, by the way. I mean, most of the people, if you go to any public housing project, in my opinion, during the day, there'll be no one there. Well, why? Because they're working. Now, they're working minimum wage jobs, might be working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, but they're working, most of these people. They're paying rent. They're paying 30% of their $10,000 or $12,000, right? They're doing their bit. And so, I just think that they might like it better if they're in more of a mixed income environment, because they're going to go by Innis, like Harbor Point. Well, I'll give you a real concrete example, a recent example. I was in I have another project in Charlestown, and I was at a wedding downtown, and this woman came up to me and she said, "Are you from Charlestown?" And she looked familiar, and I said, "No." I thought she was a resident of the Charlestown development, right? She was Spanish speaking. She looked very familiar to me from that. And I asked her where she lived, and she wouldn't tell me, right? And you find that a lot of people in public housing, if you ask them where they live, they won't tell you where they live. They won't tell you. They'll just say, "Oh, I live in Charlestown," right? Because they're afraid of what you're going to think of them because they live in public housing, because they feel it all the time, right? So I told her that I was the developer of the Charlestown project, and then I tried her again. Where do you live? And she still wouldn't tell me, right? As it turns out, I didn't know her from Charlestown project, but she lives in public housing in Charlestown. I knew her from a restaurant that I go to all the time, and she worked in the restaurant. But that's kind of you see that all the time, of people who live in this feel stigmatized because of where they live. And we probably go by some of these places and think, my gosh, who's living there? What are they doing, right? It's kind of a natural thing, but it's unfair, right? And so that, I'm not saying that happens in a mixed income that is a tax credit based, or at Whittier, for example. Mm-hmm. And maybe that stigma, they feel a little different about that when the new place is there. But they certainly won't feel that way when they live here. Yep. Or Harbor Point, right?
I think you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do you mitigate risk? And if something doesn't go according to your plan, how do you adjust to that? Would it be financially?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what you try and eliminate the risk by the time you get into the ground. You know all your budget. You have all the prices in. So you know what things are going to cost. The biggest risk is what's under the ground, right? When you start construction, you don't know. These places, they were built in 1950. And, these days, what people put in soil way back then, there might be dirty soil there you don't know. So that's where the risk is there. As soon as you get out of the ground and going up, you have no risk. You have a contract to build it for a certain amount. You have the contractor involved in the design so that, he knows what you're trying to do. He's had his say in the design, and he's priced it out. If something costs more, you got to find the money. You know, it's come out of your pocket. So that's the risk. But you try and do, you have to do a lot of upfront work before to minimize your risk, because no one's going to give you more money after you sign the contracts. You know, so. But it's just being very thorough and thoughtful, having good people designing and contracting with you. That's how you minimize the risks.
So I want to ask just two questions. I'm going to kind of group them together. There's a question here about the size of these developments. You know, is there any benefit to a certain size? So there's lots of these big projects that are out there, right? That are these transformation projects that you've seen, you've bid on, we're working on, right? Mm. You're doing that massive project in Charlestown versus Chelsea.
Right.
Is there any benefit to advancing the model of mixed income housing by looking at smaller projects?
Yeah, I mean, the issue, the detriment to this model is you need density in order to make it work, right? So we're going from 96 units to 330 units. We need to increase, that's a big density.
That's the only way it works.
That's the only way it works, because you're basically got to, you know, build 4 new units to support the 1 public housing unit, roughly, right? So that's always, unless you get some other public subsidy within it to offset some of that cost, right? So if there's a detriment to this, it's density, right? We need density to make this particular model work. Whereas if someone's doing 96 units on a tax credit basis, 1-to-1, that's basically what's there now.
Cities are growing everywhere, including Boston, including the Northeast.
Right.
So that's playing into a trend that's happening across the United States and across the globe right now.
Right.
So last question is, what are the biggest challenges that you face involving, you know, relating to the neighborhood, like following up on the stakeholders' desires, interests, and what are the challenges that you faced related to that?
Well, listen, I mean, you know, any development you do, whether it's public housing related or not, it's traffic, parking, density, shadows, all those things, right? And you got to just answer all those things through the public process, which was lengthy. We had to get zoning, but what we do is, when you talk about mitigating risk, that's a risk factor. But what we try and do, in one of these developments, you have 2 constituencies. The first most important one is the people who live there, the people, they're the ones who are the most impacted by and benefit to what's going to happen. But you got to make sure that they're on board with everything. Then the greater constituency is the neighborhood surrounding you in the city itself. And you got to answer all those questions through the public process. There's a public process for all this stuff. You don't get out of a public process. You're in front of a board, and what we do is we go out and we try and talk to everyone who's a neighbor who might be concerned about it, and explain it from our perspective, and not wait till you get to a public meeting where everyone's trying to yell at you, right? You try and do it outreach, you know, community outreach, right? And I mean, it doesn't turn everyone around, but at least kind of, you know, they at least understand why you want to be this dense here, why you have to be this dense here. They still might like it. They may still come out and, you know, oppose you, but at least they know where you're coming from, right? And so, so the public process is important. We did it here. Parking was a big one. I saw there was a question on the list there about parking and how many parking spaces. I mean, I think we're building too much parking. We're doing it in a structure. We had to do it. Now, we have a Silver Line station that just opened up, you know, 50 feet from the front door of this place. Silver Line that takes you to the airport in 5 minutes and the seaport in 10 or 15. It's unbelievable. And then if you go the other way, you get in the commuter rail, like into the North Station, you know.
So everybody who in 4 years is going to be graduating from this place and entering, you know, going out as a consultant, they should live in your place because they'll be able to go right to the airport.
Absolutely.
Good,
That's
easy
right.
transport.
They don't need a car either.
Yeah, never get a car.
They don't need a car.
So I'm going to ask if there are any other questions from anybody. Does anybody have anything to ask Mr. Corcoran before we close out? Do you have anything that you think you want to share about Innis or?
Well, I'd
this?
say just in general that, I think it's interesting that you're all freshmen here, and good for you. You get knock out a couple of cores by doing this, which is like phenomenal. I mean, boy, has time changed, to the positive. But I would say if this is interesting you to keep on and keep in this program here and the other stuff that's going on, because you're going to find a lot of aspects of this which are very interesting. And it doesn't have to be making money, and getting rich and all that jazz, although that's not too bad, right? But there's a lot of reward, and one of the things that I think my father thought in creating this at BC in particular is you come from there's an ethos here of being men and women for others, right? And I kind of feel like this kind of work for me, I was fortunate to have been brought up in this business. I didn't do anything about it, I was just born into it. And I learned it. And I had nothing to do with public housing when I was first started off in my career. I was in development, but nothing to do with this public housing. But you kind of feel like the work is worthy because if not for you, who would do it? And at the end of the day, you will change people's lives. I mean, putting someone into good housing, a stable platform that's well run. You can't imagine how that will impact that family. And I'll leave you with one example. When we got designated on another project in Chelsea, the Housing Authority wanted us to have a community meeting. And there was no place on site to do it, so we went to a community room in a low-income property adjacent to it. And we had, 50, 75 residents from the development there. And in the back, there was a security guard, and it looked like the guy who was the president of that association. And we made our presentation, and I went over and said hello to them. And so the security guard started, and he was probably a guy maybe 40s or so. And he started to ask me if I had developed these several other, like Mission Maine. You developer of Mission Maine? No, that was when. We developer of this. I said, no, that was so-and-so. I said to him, my father developed Harbor Point. And he said, oh, I grew up in Harbor Point, right? And I said, when did you grow up? Well, he was one of the very first families that moved in. His parents still lived there. And
in the 50s or in the 90s?
In the 90s.
Oh, in the 90s, okay.
And they still live there. Mm-hmm. Now, so I said, so what are you doing now? And he said, well, I've been with this security company the past 15 years. I'm married, 2 kids. We just bought a house on Lynn, right? Well, he grew up in a public housing unit, but not in public housing. His family was a low-income family at Harbor Point. And he didn't feel like that was his only option, is a point, right? Whereas in some public housing, you'll see generations there. Again, you go back to that stigma, right? I can't do anything else. I mean, this is where I'm destined to be this way. But this guy wasn't, right? And I thought that was what a great story, a Harbor Point success story. His parents are the same income probably, and they'll be there the rest of their lives. But their children didn't think they had to be living in subsidized housing the rest of their lives. And so that's the kind of impact something like that can have, right? And there's probably hundreds of kids who grew up at Harbor Point, their parents are still there, but they don't feel like they have to live there.
Yeah, that's great. Let's thank
All right.
Mr. Corcoran for tonight.